Welcome to Herbs in Action, COVID and Beyond, Replays, Session 3, Tongue Assessment, a key tool for understanding presentation and choosing herbs with Larken Bunce. This session was sponsored by the Herbal Nerd Society in partnership with The Practical Herbalist and Real Herbalism Radio, also Mud Paw Design House.
The information provided in this session and this summit is not intended to cure COVID-19 or any other disease. Due to the novel and emerging nature of COVID-19, no herbalist or medical professional can claim to cure or know how to cure this virus. We are not responsible for the healthcare choices you make, including your use of food, herbs, or any other substances for any reason. This information is not intended to diagnose, treat, or otherwise take the place of a doctor's advice. Seek professional medical advice if you suspect you have COVID-19 or other health problem. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed in our summits are those of the speaker alone and are not that of Herbs in Action or the Practical Herbalist. Use this information wisely.
So with all of that said, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce to you Larken Bunce, Executive Director, Teacher, and Clinical Herbalist at Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism. She helps people move through and heal from trauma using a synergy of traditional medicine and biomedical sciences informed by her core belief: we can restore nature to culture through herbal medicine. And with that, let me switch the spotlight here. Why did it? Hold on. Patrick?
What?
Why is it not letting me make her there we go. Yay! Sorry about that. There you go.
All right.
Welcome. It's all yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Candace. I really appreciate it. And I just want to welcome everyone. And I just want to let you know, of course, this happened right while I was, there's my friend Oliver, who's also co-hosting. He thinks that now is the best time to snuggle. So he's very talkative. Hopefully he won't, wake up or have any feelings over the next hour, but in general, he's a good buddy. And I'm hopeful that y'all are also home, safe, or in your offices doing what you need to do right now. And I'm just really honored to be able to share with you for a little while, and hope that what I share today can be of support to you and your families and loved ones. So I'm gonna just start right off the bat. As Phyllis said, there is a lot of stuff to cover, and tongue assessment is incredibly complex in some ways and also incredibly simple, but certainly one could speak about it for quite a bit longer than 1 hour. So I have condensed and condensed and condensed, and my hope is that we'll get to enough of an overview that you'll leave today with capacity to actually start looking at tongues and making some meaning out of that. But know that I do have a course which is linked at the end of this presentation, as well as in handouts, both of which will be shared on the Herbs in Action website by Candace, as she is able to. So please know that you have lots more information that you can get from me for free via this summit, as well as if you'd like to take an 8-hour course that goes a bit more in depth. So that said, my name is Larken, as Candace shared, and I'm a clinical herbalist and full-time herb teacher. And one of my great loves is to teach assessment, because it really brings us the ability to look into the body, to look into the life and the experiences in a way of a person or even of ourselves, without having to be invasive, without needing to draw blood or to look inside the body with something like X-ray, etc. So I really think that this is an incredible bridge practice that we can use that helps us to hold on to tradition and the wisdom that it offers, while also being able to easily integrate into and along with a biomedical approach. And that's such an important thing to me, as the name of our school really suggests, Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism. It's really about integration And so I hope that you all will feel that possibility in by the end of this workshop. So I'm going to go right through here, just give you a little background, talk a bit about some ethics around assessment in general. We'll look to see and understand what we're looking at when we're looking at a tongue, specifically anatomy and 8 characteristics, which we'll pay attention to. We'll look at how to connect those characteristics to qualities in nature, which some people refer to as energetics, and I often do as well. But because not everyone has the same definition of energetics, I tend to just use the word qualities, because that's also gives us the sense that it's something that's tangible, that is, while on the one hand subjective, it's something we can all look at together and share an experience of in a way that we can systematize and we can talk about. Whereas the word energetics for some people brings up some kind of idea of an intangible or a very personal or individually subjective experience, which it can be as well. But again, for me, just using quality or natural quality helps to sort of differentiate and make clear exactly what I'm speaking about. But if you're into energetics, that's what we're talking about. So finally, we'll look at a little bit at how to synthesize all those characteristics and the qualities that they indicate into some kind of meaning making. And as we make that meaning, we'll be able to then, as you see there, in our second to last goal here is to synthesize into some sense of a pattern that indicates some goals that then leads us to protocol, or rather to some actions to fill those goals, and then to protocols, which just means herbs and foods and lifestyle practices. So that's a lot to cover in just an hour, but I think with a little bit of a peek at tongue maps, a little bit of a suggestion about how we document tongues, and then lots of resources to take you forward, we should be able to accomplish it. So where I'm coming from in teaching this, it's really important for me to know, or for you all to know from me, where I'm drawing from, my lineage, with many things I'm weaving together. So this is very much drawn from East Asian medicine, specifically Chinese and Japanese traditions. I'm trained in Zen Shiatsu and Chinese nutritional therapy, what's often referred to as traditional Chinese medicine, and 5-phase theory. And those are some of my teachers: Paul Pitchford, Bob Duggan, Diane Connolly, and I really appreciate, though haven't studied personally, with the late Al Stone, an acupuncturist who's done a lot of work on making assessment, pulse and tongue, more accessible and somewhat more systematized, sort of teachable practice, in my opinion. I also have studied Ayurvedic medicine and tongue assessment from that perspective in the School of Vasant Lad via my teacher, Kevin Spellman. I'm also really drawing from a Western tradition. A lot of people don't know or think about the idea that tongue or even pulse or face assessment comes really from all traditions around the world. Any tradition, whether more formal or folk, has used these physical assessment methods. And that includes what we sometimes call, quote, the Western or European tradition. And my teacher in that in particular was Matthew Wood. And certainly I've had many teachers in Western herbalism, but in terms of assessment, Matthew shared that with me some 20 years ago. So that's a real treat to be able to carry some of his teachings forward. And then, as I said, I've been in this work for a long time. I've been studying and working with assessment in particular for 25 years, and in clinical practice, both my personal practice and also supervising students in clinic for the past 15 years. So any mistakes are mine. This is my synthesis of all of those pathways, traditions, and lineages. So please don't blame my teachers. That said, it's not mine to claim as something unique to me. This is the wisdom of everyone that I've done what I can to make it applicable to as many people as possible through this teaching. So my goals are just to do that, make it as applicable and as familiar and approachable as possible to as many people. This is something that absolutely the home herbalist should know how to do. Not that there's any shame in not knowing how to do it, but it just feels like the kind of thing that has been lost and should feel as easy to do as feeling the temperature on the head, looking to see does your child look a little pale, or boy, do they look really warm and hot. We do a lot of examination already that we don't think of necessarily as something that's systematized or that we can understand outside of just our own subjective meaning. But in fact, we're very practiced at doing this kind of assessment. We just sometimes can be supported by a bit more of a structure. So this will help you hopefully to get some sense of structure around the observations that you already do. And specifically, if you haven't been looking at tongues, get to some ideas about just even getting the basic overall impression when you look at your own or someone else's tongue will lead you into making better choices, or I should say more effective choices in terms of the herbs that you select. Because it says there, my next goal is to really avoid a this for that. In other words, we have this symptom, so I'm going to choose this herb that I saw on a list that's good for that symptom. You can sometimes hit the mark and get really lucky. A lot of times you won't. And sometimes then people feel like herbs don't work, or they lose, hope in their own capacity for self-healing, as well as just the ability for us to all take care of our families when that is, safe and accessible to do so. So getting more specific helps us to, feel better, to heal, but it also helps us have more confidence in the practices of home care. As I said, this really is a doorway, looking into the body through either palpation or through visual inspection, as we do with the tongue, really helps us to kind of open a door to what I call the inner terrain. Helps us get a sense both of the landscape, which is a way you could talk about constitution, as well as the weather, which is sort of the weather that moves across the landscape, comes and goes, and it's changeable. And that would be somewhat sort of parallel to the conditions that we may experience over the course of the months or years of our lives. As we understand, in the climate or on the planet, climate is often somewhat dictated by the landscape, right? If you have mountains and forests, then you're likely to see a certain kind of rainfall and a certain kind of cloud cover. Whereas if you have desert, then you're more likely to have a certain kind of air movement or wind, as well as a lot more heat. So our landscape does, to a certain extent, dictate our weather, or our constitution sometimes can dictate what the qualities we are more likely to experience are when we're ill. And it's so incredibly helpful to know even just the landscape, because we can make some predictions about what weather will show up. But the cool thing about the tongue is we can understand both kind of constitution or the landscape, as well as what's showing up today or what's showing up this week in the illness that I'm experiencing, and how do I address each of those things, as well as over time, if we're working with something for an extended period, how addressing today's qualities or the weather can be related to or sometimes be impacted by the landscape, or like what our constitution is. In other words, if you have a hot condition and you have a cold landscape, and you're cooling off the hot condition all the time, trying to deal with that fever, if you do that for a couple of weeks, the underlying coldness will be exacerbated, just as one example. The other thing that I love is that we can really, through these assessment practices, get into kind of the psycho-emotional world of our clients or ourselves. That's really reflected in the tongue as well as the pulse. We won't focus on that as much today, but it's just important for me to say that that's absolutely an aspect that is made accessible to us, and that's a big part of my practice as well. The tongue, being at the very beginning of the digestive system, of course, is very indicative of digestive health. Most systems of medicine, traditional medicine, really center around digestion. We're starting to see in more technomedicine or biomed that the digestion is, of course, core and so important as well. So we definitely can get a solid understanding of digestion from tongue analysis. However, we can see really the mirror of all of the organs' functions, and we can see the integrated function of the whole. Again, that sort of larger constitution, or how the qualities of an illness are affecting our overall function. And the other reason that I love tongue, although I also teach and am devoted to using pulse analysis, is that it's something you can look at for yourself, so you can assess easily, whereas you can certainly feel your own pulse, but I find it to be a little less easy to learn for folks in general, and also to do on themselves. The other thing I love about the tongue is that two people can look at the same tongue. So if you have a mentor, or even just someone you're co-learning with and bouncing ideas off of, you can both look in real time at the same tongue and see what you think and feel. We can also take pictures of it, which we can't easily do for pulse. So today we'll be looking at pictures, and I can point things out to you, and you can learn really most directly that way. And also, of course, as I've said already, I just find this so valuable for individualizing and making most specific our practices and approaches. So I've covered this, but I want to just highlight the qualities we're going to be looking at are the qualities of temperature, moisture, tension or tone, tissue integrity, circulation, or sometimes I call it distribution, and overall vitality. So we can really understand each of those uniquely, as well as how they interrelate, because of course they're not existing in a vacuum. And then we also can determine, as I mentioned, the broad individual's constitution, as well as sort of that weather, the energetic properties of a dysfunction or imbalance that's present in the moment. We can also recognize very simple patterns, which is what we'll start with today, but more complex patterns also can become more understandable, or we can at least see that they're there, even if we're not sure how they arose. And I think that's so incredibly helpful, that we can really look at the tongue with as broad of a view or lens as we'd like, or a quite specific one. So you don't have to be an expert to gain useful information from the tongue, or very experienced. You can get those simple patterns. And then as you gain more experience, then the more complex patterns reveal themselves, but you didn't have to wait to be able to apply it, which I love. Of course, we're matching plants to people and making those effective protocols. So yay, tongue assessment. That was my advertorial for you. So general steps for learning tongue assessment, we're going to go through at breakneck speed today. But know, again, that this takes time and you have more resources. So this will just give you some of the arc of what really could and should be happening over many years. It's taken me all these 25 years to feel as comfortable as I do with it. And there's still things when a student is like, I saw this, what do you think? And I'm like, I'm sure someone has a meaning to make out of that, but I don't personally, which doesn't mean it means nothing or that it's not important. It's just not something that I have learned about or created a connection to. So just to say, this is lifelong practice. And so we'll be gentle with ourselves after just learning for an hour or 3 or 8. So first you observe. As I said, we all do that, whether we're looking or feeling or smelling or listening. We are observation professionals, I like to say. We learn the meaning. So that's a little bit of just picking up what the system is that you're choosing to engage with, whether that's the meanings made by Ayurveda or Chinese medicine. Today I'm going to give you the sort of westernized version, a la me, as well as my teachers, but basically connecting the meanings in terms of quality to what you observe. Then creating some hypothetical kind of assessment. In other words, I call it synthesis, where you're really seeing a pattern from those disparate qualities that you're observing. Then you generate goals based on that assessment, and then as you hone those goals, you then choose actions and then herbs or foods or essential oils or practices to follow. I want to be clear here, of course, today I won't be teaching you lots and lots of things, but with herbal, or rather with tongue assessment in general, I want you to be clear that this isn't about learning how to make assumptions or draw conclusions about people's health absent other information or their own input in particular. This isn't an end-all be-all of assessment. It's also not meant to be used without other tools. Your own clinical judgment, your own knowledge of how the body works. Also, most importantly, the input and understanding and experience of the person you're working with. This isn't a time that we get to say, well, your tongue says this, so I'm not concerned with what you think is happening or with what you're telling me. You know, our clients or our family, whoever it is we're working with, they, in my opinion, need to have agency, they need to have input, they get to choose. And so sometimes these practices take on a bit of like a mystical quality, like, well, I looked deep into the door of your, to your inner landscape and I saw a thing you did not see, so that gives me power. That's not okay. It doesn't give us power, should not give us power. What it does is gives us information, which we then can put together with the other extremely important information, sometimes much more important information that our clients are going to give to us that we get from, again, understanding how the body works, etc. So just because this is really cool and can come to us from some ancient traditional practices does not make it, you know, it's not a crystal ball, and it's not an authoritative, especially because there's a lot of user error in the beginning. But even once you become quite good at it, what you're really looking to do is to become curious, to become more, to have better questions. And the more you look through that doorway into the inner terrain, the more you become clear that you don't know. But hopefully, as practitioners, we follow our curiosity with compassion and we ask better questions of our clients. So of course, we're not going to learn everything there is to know about tongue assessment today or this year. And so this really takes me into the ethics and care used when doing any kind of assessment, but especially when we're doing tongue. So you might have noticed that when you ask someone to stick out their tongue, or when someone asks you to stick out your tongue, there you are with your face open, your mouth open. It's weird. People are like, why am I doing this thing? I don't show anyone deep in my mouth except my dentist and maybe my, you know, ear, nose, and throat doctor. It's sometimes even considered rude to stick out your tongue. It feels very vulnerable for some people. You know, you maybe don't have great oral health, or maybe you're worried you have bad breath, or maybe you just feel vulnerable because it is. You're opening your body very literally to another person. So when we are looking, not only are we close usually to the person and they've got their body open to us in a way that we don't usually do, but they can see our face. So there's this quote that I love from Paracelsus, which is actually about observation in the Western tradition. And that is, your eyes shall be your professors. I put kind in there because we will learn the most, we will have the most rapport, the most success in our clinical relationship if we practice looking with genuine curiosity and compassion at what we see, not allowing our surprise or concern or confusion or just our own sense of I'm not even sure what I'm doing and discomfort be projected out through our face or through our gaze. So let your kind eyes be your professors in doing this. Make sure that when you're asking someone to show you the inside of their body, literally and somewhat metaphorically, that you make sure that you understand the gravity of what you're asking, even when you've done it 1,000 times. This person, it may be the first time for them. So be sure to bring this is, here I go, I've been teaching this too long, so I started to come up with silly things, acronyms, as teachers do. 5 C's of assessment: consent, centered presence, compassion, aka non-judgment, critical thinking, and curiosity. So this is really just summing up everything that I've just said. You're not requiring that people show you their tongue. You are really centered and present in your body, recognizing the vulnerability of what people are about to do in offering you this doorway into their bodies. Again, the compassion and non-judgment. Critical thinking, this is the part that's like, I see something that I think means X about their tongue, but everything else that they've told me and everything I know from biology and everything I know about plants tells me something else. I should take in all of that information and balance it against what I believe I'm observing in the tongue. Use critical thinking for this process as much as you would for any other. And then your curiosity is always what I want to come out with. People think curiosity would be first, like, I'm so curious what's going on with your tongue. But no, instead, curiosity really is what we come out with. Again, more questions, better questions. Note that conclusion is not included, because we're not going to be like, oh, now we're done. Now we know everything about this person because we looked at their tongue. So, step 1, observe. What are we looking at? We are looking, in the picture there on the right, looking here at a big old muscle covered in a mucous membrane, which does some specific cool things. The main thing I want to highlight here is that this, right, here's my cursor, this is considered the tongue body. These little bumps that sometimes you see, later you can stick your tongue out at yourself in the mirror and you might see these bumps. They're called the circumvallate or just vallate papillae, and they're specialized papillae, which are essentially these bumps covered in taste buds, and those are especially fancy because they have these like crevices where a lot of taste buds exist. The main thing is you're going to see those at the back when you look at people's tongues, and sometimes folks are like, "Ooh, what is that? It's alarming or something," but it's not. They're normal. Everybody has them. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're little. But generally, that's the farthest back that you're able to see. So the other thing that we'll be talking about is this midline, sometimes called the sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S. And then these little speckles are not usually obvious. This drawing is just trying to show you that they exist. And those, again, are like little extensions, almost, they're not villi, but they're kind of similar to the way villi exist in other, in the small intestine. They're just little projections, and again, they're covered in taste buds. On the left, we're not going to focus too much on this today, but there's something called the sublingual veins, so the veins that run under the tongue. And so they run here and here, and it's really just to know that that's what you're looking at if you look under the tongue. Again, we won't focus on that today, but that's another part that we do examine. This is just a picture of the cool vallate papillae. In the back, they have this little crevice, and then see all these taste buds lining that. They are very sensitive to bitter. So this is an interesting thing to consider. I don't know that this is absolutely true. What I've seen, so this is just Larken's clinical observation, so this is anecdote. What I've seen is that sometimes people who are very sensitive to bitter, in other words, are like, no, do not give me that gentian, have larger papillae in the back, those vallate papillae. And so sometimes when I see those, I remember, I take note and I say, self, be sure when you're thinking about what to give this person, you ask them how they feel about bitter to make sure that you don't give them something extremely bitter that they're then not going to want to take. It's not across the board. I always ask people no matter what, how they feel about different flavors, but that sometimes gives me a little cue to say like, this person might be like, ugh, not that, I will never, no matter how game they say they are. So there are 8 characteristics of the tongue to assess, as I mentioned. shape, color, coat, moisture, cracks, marks, that's kind of miscellaneous, tension or the presentation, the way they stick it out, and then what I call the miscellaneous, which generally is like anything else we didn't talk about, but the main thing is the condition of those sublingual veins, or those veins that run under the tongue. Today, because of time, we're just really going to focus on the first 5 there, and ultimately almost just the first 4. Cracks, I feel like are in some ways so clear. Cracking, it's like, think of the desert. Why do we have cracks? We don't have water. So we'll focus mostly on the first 4 and just kind of making sure we understand what those mean. But know that that's just for time as much as it is for, because they're important. They are, and you can learn most of what you need to know, but you do want to focus on all 8 eventually. So what I'm going to do for the next little bit here is to review, albeit a little bit at high speed, what we learn from each of those 5 qualities, or rather I should say characteristics, and what quality they're associated with. So this part, I can take 4 hours to go through, literally. Because there's so many cool nuances and interesting things. I just want to highlight that this PowerPoint is going to be available to you to review at your leisure. There are going to be notes that you're able to look at and read to understand it more. So I just want us to kind of get a sense of the arc here versus like, oh, you're definitely going to understand everything that's here with just my speaking, because that's just not possible. But I think you will by the end get a sense of how these things all fit together enough that you can go in the bathroom, look at your tongue, and make a little bit of an assessment just after this hour. That's my true goal. So y'all can tell me about how that worked when we talk on the panel later. So this first one is shape, as I said, and that really just refers to the shape of the tongue body. So are we talking about vertical thickness? So that's this way. Are we talking about width? And that's this way. And so you have to specify that in terms of shape, but both of those are included. And then there's also length. And then the overall size of the tongue relative to the mouth. That one's a little bit tricky and probably the most subjective of all, but when you see someone's mouth and sometimes, or just even the size of their body, and then they show you their tongue and you're like, whoa, that's a much bigger tongue than I thought was going to happen. Or you're like, huh, that's a teeny tiny tongue. There's all kinds of reasons why shape can be affected by how people are presenting. So it could be tense, they could be shy, they've never done it before, it's weird, all the different things. So you know, you have to get used to sometimes asking people to show you their tongue more than once, because over time people get more comfortable and relaxed with it, especially if they really, you know, show you only a tiny bit. But similarly, there are humans who are really excited to show you their tongue and they're like, blah! And so this big tiger tongue comes out. And you're like, whoa, okay, that does tell you something about them, probably, that they feel really like fine about showing you their tongue, but also it might be a little exaggerated in terms of it being larger than it really would be if they were just kind of doing it in a more relaxed way. So you can see there what it tells us. The width tells us about moisture and how well nourished the tissue is, or the person in general. The thickness, this way, tells you both about heat and moisture present in the body. And the overall shape just gives you a sense of vitality. So you've got like here, I'll just show you this for a second. You've got some sort of average, moderate shaped tongues. You've got a little bit of a narrow tongue, a little bit of a wide tongue, a little bit of a thin tongue this way. Now it's not as thin as they can be. I always like to say, if you can think of a puppy, how little and like thin and soft puppy tongues are, sometimes that's like how to imagine a thin tongue. Sometimes people have just very thin, and then you can see this one's much more obviously thick. So if you have a really small, thin tongue, then you can imagine that that might be like a person might have a little less nourishment and a little less vitality versus a really big, wide, thick tongue might mean there's like a bit of sort of like excess vitality or heat or moisture in the tongue. So just to give you a sense of what these slides are gonna, the pattern of these slides, there's like, what are we talking about over here? There's what is this particular characteristic gonna tell us about? There's what it could look like, and underlined will always be what we're, the healthy version or the balanced version of this characteristic is. And then this little box down here says changes. What it is referring to is how quickly does it change? How easy is it to change? So shape is a slow process if it's going to change. It doesn't change quickly. So this very often tells us a lot more about landscape than it does about weather. In other words, this is something that's a little more stable, though not unchangeable, it's a little more stable. So these are different versions of shape. Color is referring to the color of the tongue body. So not the color of the coat, which is overlaid on top, and we'll get to that, but the body of the tongue or the tissue itself. There's a whole range of colors, which we'll look at in just a moment. What the color tells us is the quality of the blood, and I'll tell you why I'm capitalizing blood there in a moment, which tells us really about nourishment of the person overall. So like the capacity of the blood essentially to carry nourishment as well as oxygen. It'll tell us about blood circulation or lack thereof, and it'll tell us about temperature. So if you note here at the lower left, I made this note about blood. This is one of the few concepts that I really like from Chinese medicine, that we don't exactly have this, we have the idea, but we don't have this sense of this concise term that tells us about essentially the carrying capacity of nourishment in the body. How well nourished a tissue is likely to be specifically or in general of a whole person. So capital B blood is talking about the quality of actual fluid that carries nutrients and oxygen in the blood or in the body, but it's also talking about just like the body's and a specific tissue's overall capacity to be nourished. So the quality of the blood is reflected in the color. And so we can sometimes say like the color reflects nourishment. This will change very quickly, as you can imagine. The options, it's like a rainbow, it's lovely. So we go from pale through pink, which is our sort of healthy, middle, red, crimson, and then you can see if you were to overlay a bit of slower circulation onto these top colors, you'd get blue. So like imagine when blood slows, it deoxygenates as it pools. So blue would be what you'd get if you had a pale tongue. Lavender is what you'd get if you had a tiny bit of pink, right, mixed with that blueness. Purple is what you get if you have red plus blue. And you'd also get a deeper purple if you were to combine crimson and the blue. And then brown black is, I did specify here, this is really actually technically the color on the tongue coat in this photograph. I could not find a picture of a tongue where the body itself is actually brown or black. And that really is a very severe circumstance of ill health, of specifically the tongue tissue or deeper in the body. That is a referral, at the very least to a dentist, first off, to look at the tongue, but likely the person has something else going on that's a more chronic condition, a chronic illness that you'd want to make sure you could ferret out. But I just wanted you to get a sense of what brown or black could look like on a tongue, even though it would be more the tissue color itself. The coat. So this is talking to us about the actual bit of kind of gunk we sometimes see on our tongue, right? This little bit of furriness. So we want to think about whether we have a coat, so the presence of the coat, how thick is it? Is it rooted? I'll come back to that. And then what color is it? So rootedness is kind of weird. It's a hard thing to describe. The best way that I can do that is to say, you have the surface of the tongue. Remember, we saw the anatomy. And then you have all those little protrusions, those little papillae, which all have those taste buds on them. And if you were to imagine that the coat kind of settles in between those little micro protrusions, and then it makes the surface look, you know, essentially kind of smooth, and it looks like it's not able to be removed exactly. Like it wouldn't look obviously easy to scrape off. That's a rooted tongue. I'm sorry, a rooted coat. If, on the other hand, it looks like it's sitting above the papillae, it looks like you could scrape it off, or even that someone smeared it on. I always gross out my students by saying, you know, like cream cheese. Then people are like, oh no, is it ever that thick? Yes, it definitely is that thick. And so it's good to get used to the idea that that could happen when you're trying to have kind eyes. You want to be able to be like, oh yes, sometimes there's a very thick unrooted coat, instead of going like, oh no, I'm surprised. So we have an unrooted coat when it looks like it can be easily scraped, or it's kind of like sitting on top of the tongue. It's maybe drying out a little bit. And again, think about, you know, when you kind of bake something in the bottom of a pot that you've left on the stove, and then it starts to kind of like that crack and not look like it is stuck completely anymore. That's an unrooted coat and not ideal. So a healthy coat is more thin, rooted, and then the color you want would be white. So it's going to tell us overall about digestive function. It tells us if it's thick, that there's moisture present. So usually if it's more thick than just a kind of thin rooted coat, then that's excess moisture. Rootedness also speaks to the vitality of the digestion. And then the color of the coat tells us about temperature of digestive function. So a yellow coat means heat in the digestion, and or overall in the system, in the body. Or a white coat will tell us about cool or just an absence of excess heat. So that changes very quickly, as you can imagine. It often changes based on what we eat, changes just day to day, sometimes over the course of a day, I find. It responds really well to changing what foods we're eating, what we're drinking. It changes over the arc of an infection, even again, just through 24 hours. So coat color and presence is a really important thing to be paying attention to, along with the color of the tongue body as we're following acute illness. So here we see the coat colors. This is pretty much no coat here, top and bottom. Thin rooted coat, moderate rooted coat, starting to look a little bit, sometimes the term is used greasy, right? Like it's a little bit starting to look like you could kind of scrape it. And then the thick, unrooted yellow coat there in the back. It's starting to almost think about peeling. You can definitely see here in the sulcus how you could kind of maybe scrape it a little bit. This is a black or brown coat, so that gives you really a sense of what you'd be looking at. Moisture is talking about the moistness of the tongue overall. A lot of people put moisture and coat together. The thing is, sometimes you don't have a coat, like we saw here, but you do have moisture. Clearly, very moist, uncoated tongue. Down here, moderately moist to very dry, and again, no coat. So I like to disconnect those two because I think they're very related, but they're not the same. So you're looking for moderate moisture, and that really tells us the state of the body fluids overall, particularly in the GI. But in general, like the secretory moisture, like how well do our mucous membranes keep themselves moist? So that could be applicable to not just the GI, but in the lungs as well. There's a dry tongue, a moderate, and then a wet one. So now we get to cracks. As I said, cracks are kind of self-explanatory, but there's some cool things we do learn. If we have no cracks, that's ideal. If we see cracks, what that's telling us about is tissue integrity. So particularly in the GI, if there's cracking, it means that there's potential for there to be some hyperpermeability or just some inflammation that's resulting in, less than ideal assimilation, or some immune hypersensitivity, etc. Overall, this suggests some dryness or undernourished tissues in the body in general, but definitely if I see a lot of cracking, I'm concerned about the barrier functions of mucous membranes in the body. And again, you would really look for this relative to lung health and the barrier functions in the lung mucosa or the nasal mucosa, as well as in the GI. This is really important. And that also can change relatively slowly. So you really have to work, because you're basically looking at re-nourishing and helping to re-knit in a kind of way the permeability, or rather the protective function of the barrier. So that doesn't happen overnight. All right, so let me see. This is the central sulcus. This sometimes is considered a crack, but most people do have one. Not everyone has a dramatic one. Mostly I don't worry about the sulcus unless it starts to get feathery, like this down here, or it's related to other larger kind of overall cracking. If it starts to look raw in any way or red inside, then that's when I'm considering it more of an indication that there's a tissue integrity issue. If it looks just like this at the top, I'm mostly not concerned about it as an indication of tissue integrity. So marks are there. We're not going to focus on this. The one thing we will see in my examples is these papillae. So we have papillae all over our tongue. When we have a lot of inflammation, then we get raised individual red papillae like this. And frankly, you see so much of this when people have acute infections that I really wanted y'all to know that that exists, because it's really a highlight of a really hot active response, immune response. But you can see there's all these other kinds of marks we're just not going to cover in this moment. Tension and presentation, again, tension is going to be an important part of overall function of a person and how well they can distribute their resources around their body, blood and nourishment, etc. But we're not going to focus on that as much today. It's simply, you'll see how it fits into the overall patterns with coat and color, etc. But tension is important. And the sublingual veins as the main miscellaneous, you can see there on the right, that's what a distended or dark sublingual vein is. If you do look for that and you do see it, then I have more concern about the person's cardiovascular health. As we're all seeing with COVID-19, that can be a significant co-factor in why people have more severe illness. So it's not unhelpful to look for that. I just don't want you to feel like if you see something, suddenly now you have a ton of fear that a person is going to be, more ill. It's not necessarily a one-for-one, but just if you are a more experienced practitioner and you have other ways to assess those kinds of comorbidities, then I would, using the sublingual veins can be another tool for you. So the healthy tongue, this is the review of what you're looking for. You want medium, proportionate size, pink in color, the thin, white, rooted coat, moderately moist, no cracks or marks, moderate tension, and nothing to see here around the sublingual veins. So that's telling you, as you see there on the left, the person is vital, they have good nourishment and fluids, they can move those around the body, warmth and fluids around the body easily, they have good digestion, good tissue integrity, their nervous system is resilient, and their cardiovascular health is sound. You can find all of that out about just looking at someone's tongue. Amazing. Today, we're going to focus mostly just on understanding, how we can really see that heat and moisture and overall vitality, or rather temperature and moisture and overall vitality present. These are two relatively healthy tongues, although they have some of those papillae at the tips. So they're kind of moving to heat a little tiny bit. But overall, these are relatively healthy. I think they've also been scraped. They should have a little bit more coat. But you can kind of just tell they're like too clean. So I think they mostly, someone's given them a good scraping. So how do we make meaning? Any system of healing that's rooted in nature, natural cosmology, is going to be assessing these natural qualities of temperature, moisture, tone, nourishment, vitality, and resource movement or distribution. Because these are things that occur also in nature. They're qualities that occur like hot, cold, damp, dry, etc. in natural systems. So while we use different languages and systems to make the meaning, really we're talking about the same thing no matter what system we are looking at, traditional system rather, that we're looking at. I always use this beautiful quote I love from Susan Griffin: "We are nature, we're nature seeing nature. The red-winged blackbird flies in us." And we see the same qualities in nature as we can see in ourselves. The words we use to describe those are hot and cold, damp and dry, tense and lax, stagnant and atrophic, and then overall deficient and excess. And atrophic is sometimes an unfamiliar term to folks, and that it's important to just define that quickly. It refers essentially to, again, the nourishment of a tissue. So when we talk about stagnant, that makes more sense. We have like kind of a bloated, mucus-filled or swollen with fluid, or blood stagnation like in a bruise. That makes good sense, right? Basically, that's the lack of movement of resources where it's stuck or pooled somewhere, often waste, byproducts of processes that have not been able to be removed, lymphatic stagnation, etc. Atrophy is the other side of that, where you essentially have a tissue that can no longer function because it's undernourished. It didn't get any resources, or no longer can get resources, and so it doesn't function. Atrophy leads to tissue integrity issues, often is associated with dryness. Whereas stagnancy also can lead to tissue integrity issues because there's too much fluid, and so cell-to-cell communication breaks down, tissue starts to degrade, and function starts to degrade. But more often with stagnancy, we think more about kind of a bogginess and a heaviness and an overabundance of, quote, resources, or resources that have turned into waste in a way. And so their stagnancy is more often associated with dampness or excess moisture. But they really are about the qualities or the capacity of the body to distribute our resources. And so they're kind of secondary to both dry and dampness, and also to tone. Because when things are very tense, sometimes fluids build up in one spot and don't get to another. Or when things are very lax, things build up because they're not being moved anymore by a nice toned lymph or blood vessel, for example. So stagnancy and atrophy, if that's new to you, don't worry too much about it, but I do find it to be a useful concept. So this is a way to look at those in somewhat of a systematized diagram. I'm very visual, so this makes me happy. My good friend and excellent herbalist, Jim McDonald, talks a lot about these qualities and lays them out in a similar kind of fashion. So giving some credit to him for some of these layout. But really what you see is the pairs all kind of related to each other. And this might look kind of overwhelming, but if you understand that, I'm just going to skip here for a second. Well, all right, I will go back up. If you understand that these qualities up here, tension, heat, moisture, and basically the stagnation, as well as this general vitality, all go together. The function, or like the nature of life, basically is moist and wet. If you think about what's the best way to, or sorry, as warm and moist, what's the best way to make sure that a wound heals? It's actually to keep it a little bit moist. And we need, of course, like good circulation and warmth and heat also to that wound to make sure that it will heal as well. In general, traditional ideas really track with this idea that vitality goes with adequate moisture and warmth, And if you think about what lack of vitality looks like, it's when we don't have enough moisture or warmth. And because of that, we will then see we'll see the condition atrophy and depleted or poor vitality. So when you understand these relationships, you can kind of see these very general gatherings of overdrive or excess responsiveness to our environment, or under or hypofunction, and not enough showing up to our the challenges of our environment. So what we're trying to do is then peek into the body through the tongue and say, what's going on with this quality of heat or of dampness? Is there enough tone? What's up with vitality in general? Is there enough of it, not enough, or is it kind of over exuberant? And so when we make those connections between what does it look like, which is the red tongue body, for example, and what might it mean, which hopefully is very obvious, heat, then we start to be able to kind of create a system out of our observations, system of meaning out of our observations. So for example, you start to see like a chart which I've made and provided in the handouts for y'all. For example, the tongue colors, here we see blue, and what might it mean? Cold. Pale, not enough blood, also potentially cold, etc., etc. So if you really want to get deep into this, this is the part where you, I think, can make some intuitive connections, but also you just have to do a tiny bit of memorization. And you can do that using the handouts. So as we start to synthesize, I'm just skipping through a few things that I basically have already said, and you can always come back if you want. You will see that there are these broad patterns of collected or collective qualities that tend to show up together. Not always, things are way more complicated than this, but for today, imagining the sort of excess or hyperdrive, hot, damp, stagnant, tense pattern, which could be sort of counterpointed by dry, cold, atrophic, undernourished, low vitality, kind of lax. I bet you can imagine some conditions or circumstances or times in your life when you felt or observed either of these in yourself, or a tendency for a person to look or express or interact with their environment kind of mostly in one of these two ways. Now the reality is that they are more complexity, and I'll show you some examples of that in just a second. But I just want you to get the sense that you don't have to, you're not just looking at heat or rather at temperature or moisture by themselves. You're usually seeing them in combination. So this is a classic hot, damp tongue. And this is going to indicate to us that there's a whole lot of excess moisture. There's that thicker coat. There are those red papillae that tell us there's a lot of heat. This is a tense presentation. See how the tongue's a little curled and even crooked to the side a bit. And the overall tongue body is red. So this is going to tell us that this person has some accumulation of fluids, that they have plenty of good circulation that's bringing the heat to their tongue, and blood quality is good, and that they're probably like really mounting a pretty good inflammatory response, possibly even to an infection. So that's a little bit of a synthesized assessment of this kind of archetypal tongue. It's not perfect for this pattern, but it's very close. If it hung out longer, what I would expect is for the coat to become yellow. And then that would be the really hottest, dampest tongue you could ever get. But right now it's hanging out at a slightly less hot white coat. Then here we have, again, an archetypal, not perfect, but archetypal, dry, cold, atrophic, and lax tongue. So you see lack of tension, it just kind of flumped out. It has no coat. It is almost, it's definitely very pale. There's a little bit of cracking. You can see my note. I'd like it to be more cracked, to be as dry and atrophic as possible, but it's got some good cracking in it. And overall, is dry within moisture. So this is going to be that sort of cold person that needs nourishment, mounts a much less robust response to things in their environment, particularly infection, and probably doesn't have a fantastic digestive fire, and so therefore not assimilating as much nutrients, leading to that paleness of the tongue and the undernourishment potentially. So, as you can see here, and I am keeping an eye on the time there, Candace, I know I'm condensing. There's also these combos that can happen. So I just want you to be aware these exist, and here are tongues that are examples. So damp cold is super classic, but it's actually a combo of excess and deficiency. So what we're seeing, even though this looks like a lot of excess, like, wow, that's a lot, it's a big tongue, it's a swollen tongue, it's wide. But what it is an excess of the damp, and then it's a deficiency of warmth leading to cold. Right? It's a deficiency of good tension leading to this laxity, which means there's not a lot of movement then of fluid and resource, so you see stagnation. So damp cold is another classic combo, and so these are more complex to address when you see, because you need to both reduce some excess and also build something that's lacking, which in this case is a vital spark and a warmth that would need to happen, and to also bring some tone or tension where there isn't any. And similarly, this is another mixed pattern, also very typical, which is a hot dry. So you can see those tongues, like, gosh, that's a really different tongue, right? Like, holy cow, very wide, pale, swollen, and oh my goodness, so tense and so dry looking and cracked. But golly, look at those edges are tense and red, and the tip is so tense and red. And so you're really seeing this combination of heat and dryness, which feed each other. The drier it gets, the hotter it gets, and the hotter it gets, the drier it gets. Tense and tense and tense. And the tissue is totally underfed, and this person is generally exhausted and hyperreactive. Right? So this is a person that, again, needs both building, nourishing because of that dryness, but also to clear and to vent out all that heat. So it's tricky because you need to nourish them while also doing some things that could take a little bit more push, right? So this is a combo person who's not very vital necessarily, or is losing vitality over time, but needs some stronger remedies to help them deal with their heat. So they can be more complicated, or not complicated, it's a very typical pattern, but you just have to think through, it's not just all excess and all deficiency. So I'm going to skip tongue maps. You all know there's such a thing, right? But you can come back to this. This just helps you to see, like, hey, here's where the lungs are. I just want you to see that. If you're looking right here, not at the very tip, but this first third, that's where you might want to look to see how people's lungs are doing if they have a respiratory infection. And that might give you some sense of what's going on in terms of what you're giving them herb-wise or what they need. So let's skip through that. Documentation, I'm giving you a log to start practicing, so please use it. This will tell you how. So I'm also giving you, again, this handout, which helps you with making the connections between, as you can see here, the shape, and it'll go through all of the characteristics, but the shape, what it indicates, which we've already covered, but it's all in this one place. Then what you might do about that, which is, in this case, you want to nourish and moisten, and then actions, and then possible herbs. So I want you to know you have this, and now I'm going to just show you ways to bring it together, and then we'll close. So here's our hot, damp, tense person, stagnant, holy cow. This is a classic picture. I've seen tongues that look like this, except where the coat is even thicker and more looking like the bottom of an overcooked oatmeal pot and yellow, with coming out of the research from China, where they've been using herbs and looking at people's tongues. So this is what you might be seeing, and like, what are we going to do about it if someone is in this position? Well, what I would say is that we want to understand that this is a robust person. Like, this is the main thing I want you all to get, is this is a robust person who's got an excess of the vital force. They have plenty of fluids. They have plenty of good immune stimulation. They have, like, you know, all the heat that they need. So you can give them strong remedies. And you are going to be looking to give them remedies that help to not suppress the vital force, but help to move the resources around, to vent out the excess or drain out the excess. So you can see, you can follow across with my logic that this tongue over here eventually wants circulatory stimulants, pungent or aromatic herbs, lymphatics, alteratives, diuretics, and possibly expectorants, if this is a respiratory condition. And so that's what, because you have all this stagnation, this is the dampness that needs to get moved. If you were then to look at the heat aspect that's shown through the redness and the thickness of the tongue, you'd look to cool and release and relax. Particularly this tongue is quite tense, and so you'd be needing the nervine relaxants and antispasmodics alongside anti-inflammatories, bitter hepatics, and diaphoretics. Here you take care using immune stimulants. You probably don't need them. If this person's mounting a robust response as it is, they may be too hot. So what you'd be doing then, taking those possible actions and herbs, which I had on the slide earlier, here's a possible daily protocol. This is just magical, mystery human. We don't know what their concerns are, but let's pretend it's an upper respiratory infection. We're going to say we need to regulate the inflammation and the immune response, remove waste, which we see is building up, especially mucus. So we're going to give them an aromatic digestive bitter tincture, which has lymphatic, expectorant, and anti-inflammatory qualities. So herbs that could do that: angelica, self-heal, baikal skullcap, dandelion root, cleavers, and citrus. Notice that that's largely a cooling formula. Angelica being the one warmer in that formula, but that's because it's so powerful for moving that stuck, sludgy mucus and waste out of both the lower GI and potentially the lungs. And we're also pulling on angelica because the Chinese angelica, or dongquai, is being used quite a bit in China for in formulas for COVID. So we're kind of leaning into that as well. And then a diaphoretic, nervine, and anti-inflammatory tea, classic kind of diaphoretic tea, the yarrow and elderflower. But I'm adding hawthorn there as well as calendula because we need, again, that anti-inflammatory lymphatic. And we need to, again, with the hawthorn, we're trying to vent, but also release some of the tension, vent the heat of the fever, but also release some tension. So that's just, as I said, just kind of a sample way that you would go through the process. And then I'll give you the pair now that you understand how I'm doing it. And for the sake of time, we've got our very pale, small, undernourished. The first is based on how dry the tongue is and cracked. And then these goals are based on how pale and cold the tongue looks. And so we need digestive bitters, blood builders, circulatory stimulants. Up here, we're going to need demulcents, so things to moisten, as well as minerals and herbs that contain them. And then we also need immune stimulants, adaptogens, and things that perhaps in some circumstances would kickstart the thyroid. That wouldn't be the case necessarily with respiratory infection, but just with this tongue in general. And so again, we'll end here with my possible daily protocol for this particular tongue. If again, it was a respiratory infection, notice that I'm doing immune stimulation. This person needs a little bit of a kick and a reminder of how to do this. Elecampane to warm, and again, to help with building digestive strength, but also if there's any lung support that's needed, angelica is doing the same. citrus again, and fennel and licorice. Notice that's a much more warming and moistening formula. And then I'm adding a ton of marshmallow or flax that's been soaked and just, it's like drinking of goo, is what I'm asking folks to do repeatedly over the day. And then a nice broth or a basis for a soup, which would be astragalus, reishi, or others of your medicinal mushrooms, Caudanopsis, rosemary, onion, and then kelp or another seaweed. And I'm suggesting this because it's nourishing and building. Remember, this person needs to be built, needs to be fed, as well as moistened. The blood quality needs to be improved, and their capacity to respond needs to be improved. And this is really the distinction. People ask a lot about whether they've heard you can't use astragalus in an active immune, where an immune stimulant or an active infection is present. And the distinction that is made is simply that when a person is depleted and is what is called in Chinese medicine qi deficient, then we use astragalus even in an acute circumstance, because if they don't have the vitality to mount the response, then there's no point in just giving them a bunch of echinacea or other kind of acute immune stimulant. And also because it will exhaust them more to constantly give them, warming, stimulating remedies if they're not building their resource. So these are folks we be gentle with. We don't give them lots of pokey, very strongly drying or excessively hot, because those can be dry remedies. Instead, we're trying to build and nourish while gently moving and making sure that they can receive the resources that we're giving them in foods and other remedies. So I'm going to wrap it up. As I mentioned, the goal is curiosity and not conclusion, better questions, and I'm sure you have lots of them now. As I said, there's plenty of resources to keep learning. There's some ideas there for even just using this information and how you could put it into practice. This is a link to my online 8-hour course if you're interested in that, as well as 2 books that I really like that you can start learning from. Here's one of them. This one has herb and food suggestions along with the tongues, similar to what I just did, which are fantastic. And then there are a couple of there's another course that's Chinese medicine focused, but especially this tongue gallery website from Machocha, who's a Chinese medicine practitioner, super helpful. So thank you so much for your excellent attention, and I'm sure you have a ton of questions. I'm not sure how much time we have, a couple of minutes it looks like for those, but I will also be on the panel tonight if there's anything else you'd like to ask me, or I'll stop talking now and make some space for questions.
We have actually, yes, quite a ton of questions, and we can stay a little bit longer if you so desire. This is like our lunch, so I'm fine with giving lunchtime, no problem. I'm going to start off with Bettina, I hope I pronounced your name right, says, so what does the tenseness correspond to with regard to tissue state?
Tension is more regarding nervous system state. So when someone has a more tense tongue, it tends to mean that they're more reactive to their environment. I don't like to say hyperreactive because that just has a weird connotation with it, but it's like more reactive than some kind of baseline. And then if a lax tongue would be less responsive or less immediately responsive. So oftentimes, so in some ways you could say they're not related, but because tension tends to restrict the movement of nourishment, when you have a lot of tension, you tend to get a lot of resources on one side, so you get stagnation, and on the other side of the tension, you get a lack of resources. So, and both of those can cause tissue integrity issues. Think about it like I say the atrophy or the lack of nourishment is like elastic in some old long johns that like at some point you stretch it and it just doesn't go back. It's just too dried out. And then the stagnation picture where the tissue is too full. If you've ever had a tomato that's too ripe, it it gets so full of water because it rains too much, and then it bursts and cracks a little. That's kind of like where there's too much in the tissue. So both of those have tissue. There's different kinds of tissue integrity problems, but basically excess of tension will cause tissue integrity issues one way or the other. And a lack of tension can also, but it's less obvious how that happens. Usually with laxity, you get more stagnation. So you get more of that like full tissue that doesn't function as well. You don't get atrophy quite as much.
Okay. And let's see here. The next question I had was from Jeff of the Herbal Nerd Society. And he asked about how patterning on the tongue changes as we age. So if he sees a pattern on his child's tongue and then he sees it on his own tongue or his father's tongue, will it mean the same thing?
Great question. I would say, it really depends. It's best with any assessment to be able to do it repeatedly over time. Obviously with kids, things are just more changeable in general. And hopefully things, with a child, it wouldn't be sticking around as long, or it's easier to shift is what my experience is. With adults, we do tend to get in all kinds of ways, sort of stuck in patterns of function. But I would say that on the face of it, in the moment, the pattern or what you're seeing means the same thing regardless of the age of the person in general. Usually if it's something that is a less changeable type of quality that you're seeing on an older person's tongue, then it probably has been there for a while and would be more difficult to shift. Whereas in the child, even if it's been there for a year, that's, likely going to be an easier thing because they're just in a more changeable developmental, stage of their life.
Okay. Stephanie asks if the front of the tongue is a good indicator of lung health, what does healthy versus unhealthy look like at the tongue tip? So what would be good lung health and what would be less?
Sure. I'm going to just race through the slides and I can show you a couple. So what you'd want, I'm just looking for some pictures here. What you're basically looking for is to have nice, pink, not tense, not a lot of papillae, not extra swollen, not very cracked. So healthy is like not, like just none of those things. And any or all of those things could show up. I've had people who, for example, have been smokers who have cracks in the tongue area. I've seen people who have just lived in cabins in the woods here in Vermont and exposed to a fair amount of wood smoke have red and puffy areas. People who have slightly cracked and purple when they've had bronchitis all winter. So healthy basically would be the absence of cracking, swelling, discoloration, or heavy coat. And then any of the things that we've talked about could show up in the lung area to indicate some kind of imbalance.
There was another one and it vanished. That's odd. Okay, well, I apologize for my semi-distractedness. There was someone, and I apologize because like I said, it vanished, but they were asking about when they get like the tooth depressions, I think they were talking about that fluted side edge. What is that?
What do you mean?
What's that about?
Basically, yeah, it refers to, from Chinese medicine refers to that as an indication of poor assimilation. Pretty much across the board, that's what everyone says that it means. So if you have those big kind of ridges, I can actually show you in my pictures, big kind of scallops, it's sometimes called scalloped edge. There we go. This is a good scalloped edge down here. This is a good scalloped edge. This is a good scalloped edge. Sometimes people call it tooth marks. But again, lots of people have really skinny, narrow tongues that are not touching their teeth, and they have the scallops. So sometimes it's clear, as it is in this picture, that the tongue is wide, perhaps a bit swollen, and it's pressing on the teeth. And that's, so they don't call it scallops in that case. But what's cool is that if you have a very swollen, wide tongue, you often have some moisture stagnation, which often will inhibit assimilation or like impact assimilation. So whether that's how you want to interpret it, that it's about moisture and tooth marks, or whether you just want to look at the edge and say, regardless of whether it's caused by teeth or something else, that's an assimilation issue. It kind of tracks either way.
Okay, and then related to that sort of would be like when you get ulcers or canker sores on your tongue, or like that swollen hepatite.
Yeah, so that one is a really good, I mean, that's just like sort of, it's not even symbolic. It's like, this is the beginning of your digestion, your digestive tract. And if you're seeing ulceration or those kinds of like heat signs on your tongue, then you want to address your overall digestive health with things that would both heal ulceration, reduce inflammation, and maybe cool heat in the GI in general.
Okay. And then we have somebody else, Maria is asking, what are the specific signs that we're seeing in COVID patients, like early versus later signs?
Yeah, I actually played a lot with considering doing like an ARC when I first decided to do this with Candace. And then it's just become incredibly clear that there is no such thing as like COVID patients. Like that we saw what came out of China originally, but those are people who are in the hospital and like, you know, they're trying to avoid venting them. So that's not who we're gonna see, hopefully, at that stage of illness as often. And so before we get to that stage, people are seeing literally everything. So what I wanted to highlight today is that depending on where you start in terms of your specific constitution, you will then have a different presentation and of the like how the virus affects you will be different. Some people have digestive issues. Some people have horrible headaches. Some people have digestive issues and respiratory stuff. Some people have intense shortness of breath. Some people don't get that at all. Early on, we were like fever and cough, and that was what we thought the whole thing was. But now we're seeing that it really can look any way, and it's so dependent on the individual. So what I wanted to highlight was, and the reason I did it this way, kind of heading here, was that if you see this tongue, it could be COVID. If you see this tongue, it could be COVID. If you see this tongue, if you see this tongue, right? So and you might see the person on day 1, it might be your child or yourself, or you might see them on day 20. And you don't know, because they're not looking maybe at their own tongue, where it was before. So you want to just start where you are, understand what's going on, ask people like, your tongue looks like you have a lot of dryness. Do you experience yourself as dry usually? If people are like, no, but I'm incredibly thirsty right now, then, you know, that gives you information about, yes, all that mucilaginous marshmallow goo is a good idea. Or you can, you know, maybe you have the person who comes and says, I'm a really hot person, and they have, you know, this tongue, then you probably don't need to give them a bunch of immune stimulants. You need to help them to manage their fever and ride that comfortably, because they're doing exactly what they need. Maybe just help them from having that excess mucus and waste build up too much in their lungs. So watch their lungs for getting more red or more dry or more coat on that part of the tongue down here. So I guess what I'm saying is this can help you to track where they're at if you're looking at the tongue every day and how they're responding to what you're giving them. But there isn't really one COVID tongue. if a person is a robust person to begin with, they're going to look like this on day 2, probably, and just worse and worse. Maybe the coat gets more yellow because it's more hot, and more of that like kind of baked on look. That's what some of the tongues from China looked like. But this is also a very likely day 1, tongue, right? And so this person, you need to cool and moisten. So I'm sorry I can't give you an answer. I really wish that I could. And that's really actually why I thought this would be really valuable, is so that you can see, you can address what's in front of you and not like a sort of characteristic set of expected qualities, because it turns out there aren't any expectable qualities. And Kitty Boy also thinks that he put an emphasis on that one. So anyway, just to say, people are seeing any and all presentations. One thing that people who are fairly robust are seeing, or we're seeing early on that we're getting reported, is just that it gets more mucus and more hot, kind of baked on, and then exhaustion at the end. So some people need the venting and fever management early, and support for the lungs early, and then they kind of collapse and then need more of that building and more of that like astragalus kind of picture. But some people need that from day 1 and can never tolerate the cooling remedies, can't ever tolerate the really strong, like that, bicuspid skull cap and really cold, a bunch of self-heal and dandelion and all of that. Like that just would never be good. So I'm sorry, I can't give you like, here's what the progression would look like. It's more for you to see where are they, watch where they're going, and then respond as is appropriate.
It sounds like what you're saying, at least in terms of how like family herbalist or home herbalist, self at home, self-care, family care, and even friends and neighbor care, getting used to the idea of everybody's kind of showing each other their tongues, but you're getting a gauge for how what does your son, your daughter, your wife, your husband, your whatever, people you're living with, partners, what do they normally look like? What do you normally see? Every morning, what do you see? And then now you're starting to feel a little under the weather. What's changing in your tongue? And how does that map to the rest of what you're feeling? Is that
exactly? Absolutely perfect. Yes. That's one of the things I suggest, is kind of like teaching yourself through reverse learning. Like once you know your tongue or your kids or your partner's tongues, and you're looking at them every day, and then you start to not feel great, or someone just shows up on your doorstep and tells you they don't feel great, and it's really clear they're like hacking up all who knows what, or they obviously have diarrhea. You don't need to look at their tongue necessarily if you have been working just fine without tongue assessment. You kind of know what you want to do, but look at their tongue for fun, because now you know that's diarrhea tongue for them, or that's big lung junk tongue for them. And that helps you learn and kind of calibrate yourself. And of course, you always have yourself to learn from, which is really, that's the easiest and the least awkward.
And then we did have another question. It came through YouTube, but I thought it was potentially a good question to ask. The person was expressing concerns about race and ethnicity, and whether or not signs look different. So,
sure.
Yeah.
The good news is that tongues are tongues are tongues. Mm-hmm. Everybody's mucous membranes are basically pink when they're healthy, and certainly there's some variation depending on the external melanin content or general skin tone. There can be a little bit of variation, but ultimately when we're looking at mucous membranes, or essentially inside of the body, it's all the same. So that's another reason that I think tongue assessment is so helpful and handy. Is different from something like, say, face assessment, which then gets into more of those difficulties, is that really a healthy pink mucous membrane looks the same regardless of race or ethnicity. That said, each of us, again, it's about calibrating to knowing what you look like, knowing what your kids and family and your community, generally looks like, when you see just like the inside of the lip, or, you can look, although don't touch your face with your people all around, but once you're all clean, you can pull your, look at, the sclera, look inside of the eyes. You can kind of start to see that pretty much you're looking at an essentially similar glossy, moist, pinked up tissue.
All right, I think maybe we have time for one more question. And that one comes from Mariana, and she says, do bubbles at the back of the tongue mean inflammation in the colon?
Is the question bubbles as in saliva or like?
It wasn't, that was exactly what the question was. So I'm assuming probably not just saliva, because saliva can move around. So I'm assuming she's probably talking about maybe some swelling or inflammation type of signs.
Yeah, so if it is actually like a raised portion of tissue in the back, I would say yes, there might be, but it's, when you say bubbles, that makes me not sure if that's what you're describing. But yeah, if you see a little swelling in a particular area, lower intestine, in the way back would be relevant potentially. Sometimes you could also be talking, if it's more to the sides, about kidneys, or if it's really central, it might be uterus, prostate, or bladder. So it's good to try to differentiate again through other means like questions and etc. I wouldn't just assume that it's large intestine, but yeah, anything that really persists, or if it's like bubble makes me think of blister, or if there's discoloration, then I really start to think like, let's make sure there's not something going on organically with the tongue. Like, let's not get so metaphoric that we don't notice that like there's a bad ulcer on the tongue, or maybe even some kind of oral cancer or something like that. So we want to be careful too. Bubble just makes me think like, oh, I hope there's not, I want to be concerned and careful about that. But if it is just kind of a little hummocky bump, then yeah, I'd keep an eye on it and imagine if lower intestine or something else in sort of the pelvic area could be affected. It could be stagnation of heat or fluid, depending on other signs.
Okay. Thank you so very much. That was a lot of information. It was an excellent tool. We are going to have, when you get them to me, we'll get the handouts and the PowerPoint links on there. And we also have links to your more in-depth courses and online courses, I believe you have as well. So it's very accessible. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everyone. And again, I'm also happy to receive questions via my email, which is in that slideshow. And also, I'll be around tonight for the panel.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All righty, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me